You were saying you grew up with sort of the community was a handful of people. Obviously, like every community, it's grown further. But I mean,
It's a small town. Long Point, I spent about 20 years full time in Long Point, but I spent about 40 years of my life in Long Point total, summers and such.
and sorry, 44.
I'm 44 years old.
Tell me your journey.
This one?
Yeah.
This one, I started this journey in Niagara-on-the-Lake, and I started that, I suppose, about 16 days ago. My first kind of 4 days were pretty rough. I have Lyme disease already, and the very first day I was out near Niagara-on-the-Lake, I got bit by another tick. So I stopped immediately, dealt with some tech issues, got some antibiotics, and so for the first 10 days of the trip, I spent them all on antibiotics for preventative, and that was like 2 weeks worth of antibiotics. So just better safe than sorry.
How long have you had Lyme disease, and do you know where you got it?
I believe I got it in Long Point, Ontario. I was a marsh kid. I constantly played in the marsh, and we call it the swamp over there, just as a local term. But it's just a giant marsh community, and I believe I got it, and I just, living and existing in an environment where it is.
What is, for people that may not know, what is Lyme disease?
Lyme disease is an infection that crosses the brain-blood barrier relatively easily, and if it goes unchecked, it can affect the central nervous system, causing irreparable damage to people who have it long term.
Can you, and again, forgive me for these questions, but can you ever get rid of it, or is it with you?
So I feel very fortunate in my fight with Lyme disease because I seem to have beaten a number of the symptoms, especially the really severe symptoms. A lot of the pain issues that I used to have, I've been able to kind of get past a lot of those sorts of things. But there's still a few times a year where there's things that go on with my body that end up putting me in the hospital. And then there's never a resolution to any of them because they can't find the issue. And about the only thing that we can kind of come up with at this point is that it's more than likely that it's a central nervous system damage from the Lyme disease.
How has it affected your life? And I know that's a big question.
It for a period it destroyed my life. I didn't have a life, and I was too sick to do normal things. There was a few months a year where I'd just be down and out and not able to get off the couch. I had fatigue and malaise. I'd work normal guy jobs and go to work and work physical, and I'd come home and I'd have crazy swollen joints and all these sorts of things. And the excuses from the doctors were always kind of like, well, you're in your 30s now, you're late 20s, you're in your 30s. These sorts of things are going to start happening to you, all this sort of stuff. They really just kind of brushed off all the symptoms that I had as just being a general arthritis type of situation.
The journey that you're on is to raise awareness for Lyme disease.
If I'm able to, I really haven't felt that comfortable talking about my journey with Lyme disease until just recently, simply because I've experienced a social stigma as it pertains to Lyme disease because the general public really hasn't been made aware of what it is. And so when you are dealing with doctors who aren't helping you and a system that's not helping you, and then you have friends who probably mean well, but they're trying to tell you things that you know not to be true constantly, it's very traumatizing, and often you don't react well. Combine that with the damage in the central nervous system, and it compounds the issues for people with Lyme disease.
Tell us about the system, how it's not really.
I've been denied care by 2 specialists. The doctor in Windsor blew me right off. She didn't even seem to care that I had multi-point osteomyelitis infections, and the other doctor I went to in London blew me off in the same manner. When I went to London, they promised me up and down that they weren't going to treat me in a particular way, and in the end, they just treated me the same way. So it's been a really challenging period of time. But I was very fortunate to have the osteomyelitis infections, I believe, because I was given IV antibiotics for six weeks, I believe it was, where I had to have nurses coming in and out of my house to give me new IVs and all these sorts of things. And I truly believe it was the IV antibiotics that really kind of helped start putting things in the right direction and help me get my life back. But I ended up I ended up 115 pounds, so there was no room any longer for any complications with this disease.
I know it's kind of a goofy question, but what is the worst part of Lyme disease?
The social stigma. Honest to God, the fact that people think they have an idea of what Lyme is, or they compare Lyme to, arthritis, and oh well, everybody goes through arthritis. It's no big deal. Just blow it off. All these sorts of things, and meanwhile, in my case with osteomyelitis, those are bone infections. There's infections in your bone marrow from the bacteria that's created in your body. And then there's a misconception that a single drug is capable of beating a disease like that. Doctors seem to have a misconception that because doxycycline crosses the brain-blood barrier relatively easy as a medication, which is great. It is a good drug for treating Lyme disease. But it's not just one drug that treats Lyme disease. It's a multi-drug process, and Canadian physicians largely are not going to do that for you.
Is the government failing?
Yes. The government on Lyme disease is definitely failing. I hate to admit this, but since I've started this battle with Lyme disease, I've met multiple families in Canada who believe their loved ones have died from Lyme disease, and nobody's doing absolutely anything about it. I know there was a Canadian lawsuit regarding Lyme disease, and I'm not sure the form or function of that lawsuit, so I can't really speak directly to it, but there were some people that tried to go after the Canadian system regarding Lyme disease, and they failed. So I'm really hoping that we get some better lawyers who can really help people with Lyme disease, because if I was given that single dose of doxycycline as a prophylactic and it didn't work, then there's thousands of people like me out here, and Canadian doctors are still doing that.
If from a kid playing in the marsh to this now, did you ever think that you'd be where you're at?
No, this is great. To be honest, everything I learned about the Great Lakes started in that marsh at Long Point. And so even though I've ended up having some medical issues and so forth for it, I still feel a lot richer from having these experiences. And I'm the type of person who at least has a backbone to tell the truth about what I've been through, because most people with Lyme disease, and I'm not sure why, but there's a lot of people like me who seem to really self-isolate once we get sick with this disease to a certain extent. And I'm not sure why that happens exactly, but I know that any of the documentaries I've kind of watched, one of the most common things that people with Lyme disease seem to do is really self-isolate, and I'm not sure if that's simply because of the social stigma of a disease that's not recognized and is challenging to be around people who don't understand it, or if that's a direct thing related to the changes in the neurological system and central nervous system.
What would you do different from the kid playing in the marsh now that you know what you know?
Back in my day, we didn't know, and so it happens innocently enough for most families. I've had other friends come to me recently and tell me that they've contracted Lyme and they've got it, and they've had some of the same experiences as me. And I can't tell people not to go outside and not to play, because for all the people I did grow up around, and all the people in the summertime that would come to Long Point, I'm one of the only ones that ever contracted it to the extent that I got it. And so they say in literature nowadays that of the 100% of cases, that about 30 to 40% of people that get a really bad case of Lyme disease will always have problems or never recover. And then there's other people who just completely fail Lyme disease treatment. And so that's another anomaly that we really don't have a lot of answers to yet, and hope that we can get to the bottom of it, because we have good drugs on the market for Lyme disease that should cure Lyme disease and treat Lyme disease. There's some evidence that perhaps people who live in high-risk environments and have had multiple exposures have a more challenging time with the disease. And so I would just like to see, a consensus on, the truth about what's actually happening, and we rarely are even able to get that much out of anybody.
Were you always a kayaker, or did this come as a result of, or?
No, I was always a kayaker. As funny as that sounds, I was always a kayaker. I was about 10 or 12 years old when I got my first boat, and if people could have seen what I was doing as a kid, they'd totally understand why I'm doing this now. I was paddling across the Long Point Bay in a little 10-foot Trinity Bay critter at like 10, 11 years old, 12 years old, and so taking on a great lake and paddling the coast and enjoying it the way I have, it's totally in line with the way I've lived my whole life.
Not to forget Lyme, but I mean, what's the journey been like? You've been camping out, I take it, along the way. What have you seen, the good, the bad, the ugly?
Well, okay, so in the big population centers, you do see a lot of homelessness, and you do see a lot of remnants of addiction. And I think that's been kind of one of the more challenging things to have to experience. I was on a pristine beach, and I posted a picture of it, but I found a whole pile of hypodermics, and I was told in this particular beach that you shouldn't be walking around with no shoes on because it's a high-risk area for drug use and drug users. And so I thought that was a really interesting scenario to find myself in, because when you're on the northern lakes, you don't see that. It's just not a part of the landscape, but it is kind of in St. Catharines to Toronto region, let's say, and I haven't really seen much of that since the Toronto region, but it's been really interesting to see homeless encampments along the shorelines and all of that sort of stuff.
One thing you mentioned that we were talking previously, you were welcomed by the homeless.
Yeah, there was one guy who had a camp set up. It was pristine. When you walked over to kind of look and see what was going on at his camp, he literally had a little cabin that he had built. He had a nice little fire pit. He had everything perfectly in line with a healthy site. And so when I saw that, I realized I really didn't feel too threatened by the situation. And he had passed by me a few times, and we exchanged pleasantries. I wasn't trying to encroach on his space, and he wasn't trying to encroach on my space. And I think that was kind of the gist of walking past me a few times, this sort of thing, just to check me out, make sure I wasn't up to anything. And those people have really challenging lives, and so I can't really blame anybody who's living out in the wilderness for taking precautions from strangers.
Last question. You've picked probably the worst time to go with the heat warnings and everything like that. How has it been for that?
I stay, surprisingly enough, I stay pretty cool in my suit. Once you get some sweat built up in there, it's pretty thick, so you stay cool underneath. And it's sort of like the folks you see in the deserts that keep themselves completely covered. They're cool under there. It's when they take all that sort of stuff off that the temperature really starts to get to them. So I haven't found it too extreme, but I'm also in the water largely. And so I think the water temperature here is pretty cool. So I've been able to keep myself pretty cool.
Beautiful. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.